some of the legal ramifications surrounding it. And that topic is sexual harassment. Sexual harassment. You know, when I was growing up in church at Faith Tabernacle, this is a term, a word, a concept. Just the word sex was never even mentioned or talked about. It was taboo. It was, you don't ever bring that up unless you're talking about gender, and you may as well use the word gender and not sex when referring to the male-female species. So while we wait for our esteemed guest to come in, I would like us to have a conversation about what we think sexual harassment is. Now, remember, you have the chat. Please feel free to place comments, questions, or even your responses in the chat, and I'll read those as they come up. But I would like, if you can, just reach out and raise your hand or just unmute yourself and let us know what you think sexual harassment is or isn't. And what do you feel about that for right now until we hear from our expert? All right, I'm looking to see if we have any unmuted folks ready to jump in and share their thoughts. You don't have to show your face, but at least let's hear your voice or see your comments in the chat. Anyone? Well, I will tell you that here in the United States, we have an organization called I see our guest coming in. I see we have an organization called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that has defined it for us. And they defined it as any unwelcomed sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, or other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature. And there are some other things that go along with that. But I don't want to give it all out because we have our esteemed guest, Mrs. Gail Grant, who is here with us this evening. As soon as you're ready to jump in, Mrs. Grant, let me know so I can officially introduce you.
Good evening, and I'm ready when you are ready.
Good evening. Yes, we have.
My apologies.
No problem. No problem. I know you're busy, but we are so delighted that you are able to fit us into your busy schedule this evening. So we have as our guest, Mrs. Gail Grant. She is the labor officer attached to the Industrial Relations Center of the Labor Department in Barbados. And she is going to be our expert guest here this evening to talk about this topic that is a global concern. So I will give her a minute or so to introduce herself. I know she has other accolades that she can share with you. I'll give her a minute or so to introduce herself, and then we will dive right in. Mrs. Grant?
Hi, good evening. Good evening to everyone, and thanks very much, Pastor Neff, for inviting me to discuss. So I don't want the presentation to be one where I am the only person speaking. I would like some feedback. You can post your questions in the chat box, and I will seek to answer them as we go along. I need to adjust my camera, sorry.
Okay. While you do that, let me remind others to reach out to your friends, family members, neighbors, church members. Invite them to check into another segment of Real Talk Family Life. Let them know our topic for this evening's discussion is sexual harassment, and that we have an expert guest here with us to discuss and share with you some of what the laws say regarding this global concern. So invite them to come along. They can log in on Zoom, send them the link, send them the credentials for Zoom, or invite them to join us on YouTube. We are live on YouTube right now, so invite them to come along and participate in this discussion. All right, so let's go ahead and dive on in. Don't forget, we have reactions that you can use if you hear something said that the question asked you, you really resonates with. Raise your hand, clap your hands, use the emojis. Let us know that you are here and that you are participating and that you're engaging in this dialogue. All right, so we would start with the very basic piece of information, because I think this is where oftentimes people get thrown off track because they don't understand what the legal definition of sexual harassment is. So I'm going to ask Mrs. Grant to enlighten us on what the legal definition of harassment is. And I ask this question because I have had many male counterparts and friends ask me, how am I able to connect with a woman that I am interested in if I cannot express my interest physically or verbally comment on how she looks or how she feels? How am I going to get me a wife if I cannot make comments or physical advances that would indicate that I am interested in this person? But let's first start with the definition. Mrs. Grant?
So when we speak about sexual harassment within the context of Barbados, it speaks about, the law currently speaks about within the workplace, but any place could be a workplace. And it is still good to know because you never know how this information could help you in your day-to-day life. And the church is part of our day-to-day life. So this is why it's important that persons understand exactly what sexual harassment is. I will share my screen. And I'm not able to share.
Pastor Henry, please make a co-host so she can share her screen.
So when we look at sexual harassment, and as Pastor Neff said, the guy wants to know, this gentleman wants to know, how is he going to find a wife? But if it is that his discussions with her are not enjoyable or reciprocated, then it could more be harassment. When it is of a sexual nature, then it is sexual harassment. So as we look at sexual harassment, you will see certain words that will come out.
You can share your screen, Mrs. Grant.
So let's just look. So when we look at sexual harassment, it looks at sexually suggestive words, comments, jokes, gestures, or actions. But it's not just these words, these comments, these jokes, but it is those things that annoy, alarm, or abuse that person. So you can still have your jokes, you can make comments, there might be a mutual attraction between someone, but if it annoys, alarms, or abuses that person, then it needs to stop. It means that the other person is not comfortable. Sexual harassment also looks at the initiation of unwelcomed. So it's not welcomed. So the person does not want you to go any further. Or request of sexual favors. Now, if there is a relationship and it is going to move from one stage to the next, then that person should not be requesting any favors. They shouldn't. And we also look at sexual harassment as the initiation of uninvited physical contact. So when we look at uninvited physical contact, this is not simply how we greet one another in church, you know, you greet your brothers and sisters in Christ, but where that touch is uninvited, it is unwelcome. I don't know if a person has ever had someone touch them, you feel uncomfortable. So you hear the words coming out. uninvited, unwelcomed, uncomfortable. Asking a person intrusive questions. Now, if it is within the workplace, and even though the legislation does not yet speak about church as sexual harassment, it may still be a civil offense if you make a person uncomfortable. So one person should not be asking intrusive questions, especially those of a sexual nature that pertain to a person's private life. Everyone in this presentation is an adult, right? Everyone.
Yes.
So transmission of sexually offensive material, sexually offensive telephone calls, any other sexually suggestive and offensive nature. So you would have heard certain words coming out: unwelcome, uninvited, uncomfortable. The words on the screen, these words give effect to what sexual harassment is. Inappropriate promises, inappropriate jokes, requests as a way of advancing. So you will get that promotion if so-and-so is done, right? Those things are what we would describe as sexual harassment.
Well, Mrs. Grant, I have heard my male counterparts say, well, I didn't think it was offensive. I didn't feel it was offensive. I didn't intend it to be offensive. What do you say to that?
But you have to always check a person's reaction. And what people would have tolerated before, they may not necessarily tolerate now that there's a law to protect them. So if you make a comment or a joke and you meant it in the most genuine way without any sexuality in it at all, and you find that you don't get a reaction which encourages the conversation to go any further, or the person wants you to continue to hug them, or then you should just end it there. No matter how you feel, you have to look at how the other person feels. And that is what sexual harassment is. Not only about the person who has given the joke or the person who has, they may just be making a joke or a comment. It is how that other person feels.
So what I hear you saying is that word unwelcomed or offensive is not dependent on the person who is actually doing the behavior or action or making the comments. It's based on how the recipient feels about it. If they feel it's unwelcomed, if they feel it's offensive, if they feel it's alarming, if they feel uncomfortable with the gesture, etc., then it is unwelcomed, and therefore it should stop.
Yes, and currently our legislation only speaks about the workplace. But what we try to do is to make sure that persons are aware, so that when this legislation is not only a labor legislation, but it becomes civil legislation, that persons where these things would have been required in the workplace, persons would have become so accustomed, or our culture would change to in such a way that persons are now taking into account how that other person feels, that we take it back into civil society. Right.
Okay, so you mentioned in the workplace, and we're gonna stay with the workplace for right now, because I think all of our audience members here this evening participate in some type of workplace where the laws, and even though we have people from various countries attending this session, globally, there is some type of sexual harassment law in effect. And especially when it relates to the workplace.
Yes.
I like what I see on the screen. You are
Mhm.
showing some images of some types of behaviors that
And
would be
a
considered.
person,
Mhm.
which may be considered sexual harassment. So it may go as far as stalking a person. You know where someone lives. You don't just show up at their house or make things that do things to them that make them uncomfortable. It threaten them about their employment. Persons who do not accept sexual requests may find that they're humiliated within the workplace. They may have jokes against them. And especially if you're holding to your Christian principles, and there may be stuff going on within the workplace of a sexual nature that you do not want to be a part of. Persons may try to make you seem as though you are the one that has the problem, when all you're doing is standing on your principles. And that's not easy. It's never easy to go against what is already taking place. But the law is there to protect those. The creation of this law is to protect those most vulnerable. What we have found is at least every person knows of a story, knows of a place, no matter where we're from, no matter what country we're from. I think most of us could think back about a place where you would have heard, to get a job there, this is what you need to do. To get a promotion, this is what needs to happen. Sometimes, and a lot within the West Indian families, sometimes you may have a single parent family who that person is very dependent on that job to take care of their family. And culturally, the person who has to take care of that family is sometimes most vulnerable and expected that to keep their job, they need to do these things. I'm sure when we think about it, we could all think about some place, some person, somewhere. So we need to get in there and get a change for our culture as it relates to thinking that this is just part of our culture, but this happens all the time. What's the big, some people say, what is the big issue? That was happening for years. No, we have to make everyone comfortable. Right.
So there is a
Create.
question in the chat, and I'm hoping that the Henrys, whichever one it is, would come on and ask the question verbally, because I think it would be better coming from you than me reading it. I'm not sure if it's Bevon or.
Good night.
Hi, good night.
So the question is, what happens in an instant? Because I have two questions, but they're the same. There's a lot taken into consideration, intention or motive, or of the person who is accused of committing the act. And because I know with things like murder and all those things, we have mens rea and all those other things. And then my other question related is, what if the person who is accusing had a history and they were actually triggered? So maybe what I said was not really offensive, but they took it as offensive and felt threatened and harassed. And now that becomes a mar against my character when it probably shouldn't be.
So the first question is, what if, let me make sure I understand. What if by saying something you trigger someone's reaction? Now, when there is a case of sexual harassment, the first thing is that person must put in writing that they feel harassed. At least they must report it. It must be reported. Now, that matter is to be fully investigated. And during the investigation, it may be found that the person was in a position where they may find something offensive that the normal average person would not. The legislation also states, and let me go back to the definition, it says we're a reasonable person. I don't know if I have that. Oh, okay. But the law speaks about being reasonable. So where a reasonable person would expect that that may be offensive. So if it is found during the investigation that there's something that would trigger that person that a normal person, any other person may not have, because I don't want to say normal, that any other person may not have considered it as sexually offensive, then it is within the workplace to try to offer the support and counseling so that that person can be comfortable in their job. But a greater thing is that some behaviors that we exhibit at work may not be able to. It is not meant to make the workplace very rigid, but when you're in the workplace, you have to be aware that just as in church, you have to be aware that there are a lot of personalities, a lot of persons who have gone through things that we may not be aware of. So you have to be very sensitive, not sensitive to the point where you have to walk on eggshells, but just be sensitive to how persons react. But an innocent person would not just get accused wrongfully if the matter is thoroughly investigated. And there are outlets that if a person believes that because of the investigation, it was not thoroughly investigated and they were not given a fair trial, then that matter could be referred to the Labor Department for us as a person outside now to do our investigations. And we will base our decision then on what we find.
Mrs. Grant, would you then encourage our participants this evening that if they are in a situation at work, because we're still dealing with the workplace, where someone says or does something that falls under the uncomfortable, unwelcomed behavior umbrella, that they need to indicate, to let that person know, or to let someone know, especially the person who did it, let them know that you don't appreciate the comment. Please do not do this, and even you may even go as far as to say, if this happens again, I will make an official report. Because oftentimes a person will say, well, he never said that, he didn't like it, or she never said that, she was uncomfortable. But I think it's always a good practice to let someone know immediately if that behavior, that comment, that gesture is certainly not welcomed. Because oftentimes people say, well, even though you didn't smile, or even though you didn't, show in your nonverbals that you accepted it, sometimes people do not pay attention to the fact that others are not smiling when they are. And it's important to let them know up front, before it goes any further, that this is not acceptable behavior.
That is correct. So your first line of defense is to make sure that you say up front, I do not like this. I am not comfortable. Stop. A simple word, stop. Let us not have this conversation, but you must state that you're not comfortable. So in fairness, when we look at fairness, fairness is not only about feeling, but in a legal aspect, fairness is not about feeling, it's about process. So when you're looking at fairness, you say, is it fair to tag along someone, make them feel there's no problem, and then claim sexual harassment? That wouldn't be correct. you should stay upfront. No. It may lead to inappropriate workplace behavior if a person gives into it and then at the end say they didn't like it. That may be inappropriate. But if it's sexual harassment, you have to say upfront you are not. You don't like this behavior.
In the chat, if it is your boss, would you propose saying that with HR or legal representation, or just a one-on-one with the boss, or
Okay.
put it in writing? What would you suggest?
Yeah, the first thing you have to do is put in writing. But if it is, I'm going to go, if the lodging of sexual harassment is with the employer, let me see. Let me look if it is. It should have a slide. So if it is the actual employer who is responsible for sexual harassment, then considering how big or small the business is, the matter could be sent directly to the chief labor officer. If it is, I'm just trying to. Okay. If it is that it is a small business and is the person's supervisor, then you have to go through your company's policy. So if it is a big organization, is your supervisor and there's someone above that person, then you write to the HR or whoever is responsible for dealing with those matters, because there may be a committee that is set up to investigate and deal with those matters. Whoever is responsible, if it is that is the actual CEO of the business, then you got to take into consideration, it might be the CEO, it might be a board member, it may be a small business where it's just the person and their employer. Then those matters come directly to the chief labor officer, because you go in a more vulnerable position and the law is looking to protect the persons who are most vulnerable. So you don't want to put a person in a position where they become even more vulnerable.
So here's a follow-up question. If it is a client and your office refuses to take action, is that even possible?
Of course. So everybody knows what a client is, someone who does work with the business. And the client is not employed by your company. So it might be the person who's there to fix the photocopier.
Right.
But this person comes into your business and sexually harasses you. Your employer has a legal obligation to notify that person's employer. If it is that that client is a self-employed person, then your employer has a right to protect you, because as an employer, legally, you are to provide a safe working environment. So there must be some way that it is dealt with. If there's someone else, the boss will have to speak to them if it is that they're self-employed and the boss has contracted them to come in to do some work as a self-employed person. Like the person may not work for any particular company, but they fix photocopiers across the country or across the region, then the employer has to protect you. That is the duty of an employer. They have a duty of care, and once you are under a person's employ, they have a responsibility to make sure that they provide that safe working environment.
So what I hear you saying is that your employer cannot just sweep this under the rug. They are duty bound by law to investigate and to report this.
Yes, and that is why it is so important that the steps are followed. So when that employee writes to their employer and says so and so occurred and it was uncomfortable, that employer has 14 days within which to investigate. So if no action is taken or you don't get a response, then you have a right to bring the matter to the chief labor officer. And when I say the chief labor officer is not just the actual chief, but all of those officers who have authority under the chief. So when we do our investigation, we don't investigate based by what is said. We need to see documentation. Now, I am not sure about the other territories, but I will speak about Barbados. Within our culture in Barbados, we don't like to write. And sometimes it may seem a bit hard to ask a person to write. But if things are in writing, there is no debate as to what action was taken. So many times people do not write, and employers, because I'm sure some people here may be employers, sometimes employers do not write. And they would come to us and we would say, but where's the documentation? Oh, I didn't want to put it in writing, but you protect yourselves when you write. Okay.
Absolutely. So I have a scenario for you, Mrs. Grant. I work in an office setting with at least 30 plus mixed gender employees of varying ages. I often go to the copy room where I encounter some of my male counterparts. I noticed that on many occasions, when there were 2 or 3 of my male supervisors in the copy room, they would pause their conversation, look at me, and then one of them would make a comment to me that I felt very uncomfortable about. What should I do?
Could you repeat it again, Pastor Neff?
I want to correct you, not Pastor Neff.
Sorry, Pastor Neff is there. It's just Dr. Neff. Sorry.
That's okay. All right. So basically, I work in an office, and whenever I go to the copy room, some of my supervisors are there. They would stop their conversation, look at me, and one of them would make a comment to me that made me feel uncomfortable. These are supervisors. What should I do about it?
First thing is, how does it make you feel? You've stated how it makes you feel.
Mm-hmm.
So you're in a situation, you are most vulnerable, and vulnerability is looked at in the workplace as the person who has the least authority.
Yeah.
So you stated that you're in a room with supervisors, and therefore there is the question of, if I do or say something that is not to their liking, what happens? I would like to hear some people comments before I say. Is it possible I can ask some people if they want to say anything, or?
Yes, absolutely. If you could
yes, I would like to hear.
Stop screen sharing for a minute so we can see everyone. That might be helpful. There we go. We're going to throw this question out before she gives the official response. We're going to throw this question out to the audience. What would you do if one of your supervisors make a comment to you that is uncomfortable, and of course you are afraid to say something because you're thinking, this is your supervisor, let's say, for example, your annual review is coming up. These are people who have control over your work function in that department. What would you do?
There's no right and wrong. I just would like to hear some comments. Yeah, everybody.
Anyone? Uh-oh. I'm going to call someone. Sherry, what would you do? Oh, go ahead, Bevan.
No, I'm asking, is it that the supervisor made suggestive comments, you said?
Yes.
It depends on the relationship with the supervisor. I've had a supervisor who made some comments that was not 100% correct, but knowing him, knowing his nature, knowing the context, it wasn't taken in any way because of all the things that I've said before. But I think in a situation like this, personally, I might let it slide the first time. And if it happens again, then I would address it. And then depends on what is said. If it's something that's slide, I would let it slide the first time. If it happens again, then I have a conversation with them first. Actually, in our workplace, you need to have a conversation first, and then you do the official written verbal warning. So we have procedures.
So you would not have that conversation immediately. You would wait and see if it happens again before you
if
have
it's slight, if it's not something that is outrightly, obviously sexual harassment.
Well,
like a
okay.
comment on women, or a comment on, this woman are dressed so sexily in this office, something like that.
Got you. I saw a hand raised. Okay, so we will hold on to your response, Bevan. I think Pastor Griffin had his hand raised.
Hi, good night. I only want to say that I think in general, people always, a matter of fact, I heard a gentleman was speaking, an older gentleman, he was speaking to me about my father. And he said, my father said to him, if a man put his finger on you and push you, he said, you need to tell him, don't do it again. Because when he push you first with his finger, he's trying to find out how far he can go. And if you don't stop it, the next thing he push you down. I ain't got no more to say, pause.
I like that.
I like that as well.
I like that response. Anyone else? Anyone else? Someone else? How would you handle it?
I think sometimes,
right or wrong.
I think sometimes, we have to find that space to identify yourself sometime. It will help to, identify yourself, I mean, it could be a good morning, a good evening, it could be, something that would show that you have control of yourself too now,
Okay, so keep in mind what the supervisor said made me feel uncomfortable.
Okay.
Made me feel uncomfortable.
I like the comment so far. And what it's saying to me is we have to look to see in what context it was said. That's one of the things that you would look at. Did it occur already? I can't remember the name of the person that spoke first.
Bevan.
But Bevan?
Yes.
Right, she made a very important point about whether it occurred before. And she probably let it slide the first time. But if it occurs again, then she will say something about it. So is this, when you look at that scenario, you look at all of that. Did this happen already? Is it known that this person does this? But has the person decided, this is the culture within this organization, but the buck stops at me. I am going to be the person who will open my mouth and say, I'm not accepting this. So coming from that one scenario, there's so much other responses to that situation, right? So I'm trying to get across that there's no one answer for how you would deal with or how a person feels as it relates to sexual harassment or at what point they will complain. But I will say that one single incident could give rise to sexual harassment. A person may, like Bevan said, they can let it slide, and if it occurs again. But because persons have the backing of the law now, some person will say, I am not going to accept this anymore. I am going to speak out. I see there's a comment in the chat.
Mhm. Pastor Henry sharing that recently he was at a supermarket here in Barbados and witnessed a man move so close into the space of a woman that she had to loudly express her disgust to get him out of her space.
And this
During COVID.
person was an employee. Just asking. Let's see. If this person that was within that space, if the person, the woman, is an employee, then customers is different.
Customers, yeah.
That is a civil matter. So she could make a complaint to the police. Even though it took place within the supermarket, each person is allowed their space. So that is a civil matter. If the person is invading your space, invading your privacy, then you have a right to say to security, probably, this person is within my space and I don't like it. Which still brings up the same thing about saying I don't like it. So that if it is reported, security can say she did report, she didn't like it. And I'm going to ask a question if I could, Dr. Neff.
Yeah, absolutely.
I spoke earlier about culture, and based on the scenario given by, I think this is Pastor Henry, now, right? I have it correct? Right.
Yes.
Based on the scenario seen by Pastor Henry, do we find that cases of sexual harassment, or we think that a case of sexual harassment is only from a male to a female?
This is for the audience to respond to?
And yes, from the Henrys, if the sexually suggestive look makes you feel uncomfortable, you should make the person aware, I don't like the way you look at me, but it can be. So, Danae, I don't know if you want to speak. If you don't mind me calling you Danae Joy. I spoke, before I saw your comment, I asked about sexual harassment. Is it only from male to female?
Danae, do you want to speak and ask your question? It's a great question. Because oftentimes when we speak of this, the thought is male to female. And her question was, can we also look at the sexual harassment of men? Many times we look from the female perspective only, but in the rapidly changing workplace, men feel pressured from women as well, but rarely speak out. Also, can we use some more examples in our discussion?
Sure. Danae, you wanted to speak, or you want to just go based on your message? But she may not be in a position to speak.
May not be, yeah.
The way she chat.
Yeah.
So, as I said, any person, before I address Danae's comment, I asked, is sexual harassment only from a female to a male? Anyone? And then I'll give you some. Let's hear what are the men thinking? Can a man be sexually harassed?
You can put your responses in the chat.
Pastor
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. I believe that men can be sexually harassed. I don't know why women feel that they could come around me and dress half naked and everything in front of me, or come over me with all the chest exposed and I can feel comfortable. No, it makes me uncomfortable. Men do get uncomfortable and men do get harassed.
Yes, Pastor Griffith. I like your comment. It is true. It is how you feel. So if you don't feel comfortable, you have a right to say that you're uncomfortable. Anyone else?
There's one in the chat. It says, of course, women are the chief offenders.
They are, I must say, they may be, because there are workplaces where a young male may go to work. He may be 18, 19. Think about in a family where this young male has always been taught respect for women. He brought up in a Christian family, and his intention is to marry, start his family, not to be promiscuous and have a lot of women. And here he goes from out of this sheltered environment into this workplace. And all the men at work say, wait, you know, he's a man now, you and mommy's boy anymore. You got to prove he's a man. And it is known within this organization that this particular woman, who may be in her 40s, and this is a reality, she preys on young males. Now, some of the men would say, and when I go to do presentations, many times, some of the men would say, that is experience, that is a part of life. Is it fair for this young male who has gone into this job now as this quiet individual, first time in the world of work, that he is to succumb to the advances of a woman who is much older than him? It may not be someone who's much older, but I would think that in a situation where he at this age is proposed or advanced by anyone, that one will have to be more experienced than he is. So how does he react to this when he does not want to be seen as though he's soft, or have a rumor started that he doesn't like females, or he's going through in his mind, how do I deal with this? Because I don't want the men to think I'm soft, but I know that it ain't right. So how do I deal with this? If I complain now, the men can make sport at me. They can say, oh, he must say I like girls, or I wish I had that opportunity. He's going through all these things. Is that sexual harassment? Is it? Yes, it is. Because it is uninvited, it is unwelcome. And the reality is, males are sexually harassed within the workplace. The boss is a female, and she says, you'll get a promotion if you have sex with me, if you perform some sexual favor for me. Then that male also is vulnerable, and he has the same feelings as a female in that position, and he has a right to be protected. He has a right to be, but our culture doesn't really lean to it. And our culture tends to think that when men make complaints of sexual advances, then they may not be intersex, or they may not be a macho man. But that's not so. Persons sometimes just are not about that. So they need protection. And how can we help? How can we, as that individual at work, where a male comes to you and says, it may not be a young female, suppose it is someone who is older and they have gotten married and they've made a decision, this is how I'm going to live my life. I am not going to, they may have been running around before, they may have had past where they did that. How do we, as co-workers, help a male who comes to us and says, I am not interested in this, I want to make a complaint? How do we as our co-workers, if a male comes to us, because we know if it is a female, if it's your girlfriend, you'll probably say, no, don't stand for it. Don't stand for that. You feel uncomfortable, you got a right to complain. How do we as co-workers, how would we react if a male co-worker says to us, no, I'm not comfortable, I want to make a complaint?
Good night. Hi, good night.
Good night.
Go ahead.
Firstly, the culture of the Caribbean and such matter has to change towards male. As was mentioned before, our culture deems a man, if he makes a complaint with such as weak, or he's gay, or all of these things. So that sort of status has to change moving forward to allow such reports to be handled. And it is not just that alone. You have violence against men, abuse against men physically. We make a report. Even the very people who are supposed to protect you laugh at you and make you feel so small. So as a result of that, a lot of things has to change with how we are taught as young men, because within our homes, our parents would tell us, get up, you're not supposed to cry, you're a girl, and all of these things. So men, this thing has to go so deep to change the whole status quo of how we relate to such in this thing. So there's a whole culture change has to take place. And we had to look at within the scripture, Joseph encountered such, and he was jailed for running it. And if we as men run, we are laughed about, we feel so bad.
Yeah.
So this is something that has to change from deep within society.
And I will add to that, Brother Georgie, that's not just unique to the Caribbean. I think across the world, because men are supposed to be macho, they're not supposed to appear weak, they're supposed to be able to handle these situations. And oftentimes, these sexual harassment against men go unreported. Men just keep it, they don't even tell their male friends because, again, like you said, they do not want to be considered as weak, a wimp, and we have lots of other words that we can say that they can be called. And because of that, they just keep it to themselves and suffer in silence. Let's put it that way. But a lot of males are sexually harassed just as females.
And
There are some
just like that. We hit out to us. We hit out in a violent way when these things happen, and we cannot, have a way to actually deal with it and feel that it has been dealt with. So you see the end result of such incidents, and something has to change to make a level playing field with such.
So moving on, agreeing with what you said, something has to change. We need a culture change.
Mhm.
So how do we as Christians, don't mind this is the workplace, but how do we help in protecting those who are most vulnerable? What is our responsibility as a brother and sister in Christ? What is the responsibility of the church in making sure and helping with this culture change? Do you see that there is some responsibility for each of us, whether at the level of the church or individual, to make sure that we educate as much persons as possible so that there is no shame, whether it is female to male? It may also be male to male. That is a harsh reality of life. The sexual harassment is not only male to female and female to male. The sexual harassment may be female to female, and it may also be male to male. Mm-hmm. So in speaking about this, what I will say is we all have a responsibility to be our brother and sister's keeper. And when persons confide in you, then we should not make them feel ashamed. And if each of us take that step, then we will start to see the culture change. But we all have to start with it. So when we hear, this person has been propositions. I remember one time I was doing a presentation, and majority, it was to a board, or it was a board, or it was off anyway. And there was this one gentleman, when I started to speak about sexual harassment and it being male for female, this gentleman said, I am so glad you spoke about that, because I feel so, because all the time the men always pressuring me. And I don't be about anything. So I'm a Christian and I am not about thing. And the men start in the same presentation, oh, no, I don't, start to be very hard on him. So I had to try to change the tone and to let everyone know, look, it is their responsibility because the culture change starts with me. I can't wait for the culture to change.
Right.
We have to look at protecting one another. And I seen a comment here I wanted to comment on from the Henrys, asking about if that's a healthy way for a man to live, almost on eggshells, oversensitive and conscious, or is it that we need as females to feel safe? We don't want a society where persons have to walk on eggshells. We want everyone to be comfortable. So the culture within the Caribbean, I can only speak about within the West Indies. Sometimes we take things into the workplace that are meant for outside. We can have to move to the point where we take those jokes outside of work. There's certain discussions that we really should not be having in the workplace to begin with, but within our culture, it happens. So we may have to take some of these discussions, some of these pornographic material or jokes or just a little, whatever it is outside. It has no place in the workplace. Execution of power. You have to treat everyone with respect. And if within the workplace, or if we start in civil society to show respect, then we start to learn what respect is. And people do not have to be on eggshell, because if someone goes out, they get out of place, then they start to feel uncomfortable as well. Of course, something may be said and they may only realize after it is said. And that's how people can apologize. If it is not anything that is majorly offensive, they can apologize and go from there, make the change.
And you said the word that was on my heart just to mention. So thank you for mentioning it. Respect. It comes down to respect, how much you respect yourself and how much you respect others. We have two raised hands. I will start with Pastor Henry. I think he had his hand raised first. Pastor Henry, go ahead. And then I'll come to Pastor Griffin.
Dr. Neff, I'm not so much, I don't so much feel that I am sexually harassed by the way women dress. I love the beach, and if they choose to dress like they're on the beach in church, I think of them as being on the beach. But I have a problem. A real serious problem. Because there are some women who would give you a bear hug. Sister would give you a bear hug, and I feel very much uncomfortable. When I say that, many times, people do things out of brotherly, sisterly love and what have you and so on. But I think that is one that really, to me, it goes a little too far. I like the holy kiss, probably, but the bear hug, I somehow, yeah. If you understand what I mean.
Well, that's a great segue, because our next section was on sexual harassment within the church environment. And the church environment has two components to it. What happens on Sundays in service with congregants and so forth, and then what happens in the church office. I see the church office as any other work environment that's governed by law, and the laws of the land regarding sexual harassment does govern the church office, the official church office. But getting back to the other part of the church, where we're talking about congregational gatherings and so forth with members, and where we greet each other with a holy kiss, and we, as church members, as Christians, we tend to hug and kiss and touch and greet and so forth, and we consider that normal behavior. And at times, I think some of it could be considered sexual harassment, because not everyone, the bear hug is a great example. You know, is a bear hug necessary? And if a bear hug makes you uncomfortable, then you are definitely falling into that civil area of being sexually harassed. Mrs. Grant, what do you say about that?
I within the church, you have to be very careful. And the pastor, as pastoral leader, he or she has to be very careful. I remember speaking to a group about sexual harassment. This was a church, and this person gave me a situation which I will share with you. So the person was going up to the altar, and after church, the pastor came around the corner and I heard the female saying, and it was speaking my Bajan terms, man, I had the pastor real good. When I went to the altar, man, when I hold over, he was looking. I had he good, man. And the person was there bragging to these other females. I hold on to pray and they could see the pastor looking. So as a pastoral leader, as a pastor, you have to be careful because you have a certain position within the church. And there are persons who know that you will come and hug or give a little kiss, who may not mean it in the best possible way. They may have another intention. So you need to be careful. And just as the person who is sexually harassed needs to say no, then you need to set boundaries. And if it is that you don't like something or you would rather not something, you say up front, this is not what I like, or in the future, you know, but it would need to be addressed because there are persons who will set out.
Yeah.
And I guess as adults, I can say this, there are persons who will look for men in uniform and pastoral leaders. That is their intention. Everybody that comes to church is not coming to hear the word of God, but it is interesting how God could turn around what was meant for evil and make it good. But everybody's intention is not genuine.
Yeah.
So you need to be careful.
Very
I hope
well
I addressed
said.
your answer.
Yes,
Your
absolutely.
question. Yes, within the church, you have to be very careful.
Yeah.
Very, very careful. It is so, I don't want to say that the flesh is weak because that sounds very out there in the world, right? To say that the flesh is weak. There are persons who will purposely tempt you.
Right. Right. This is premeditated. This is purposeful behavior.
Yes.
This is not a weak moment. This is something that was done on purpose to compromise the man of God. Absolutely.
Exactly. So
in the church, doesn't it become a he say, she say scenario? Is a comment in the chat. In the church, doesn't it become a he say, she say scenario?
Any situation could be a he say, she say scenario if it's not investigated correctly. Now, if it is that an allegation has been made against someone, it is better to have someone independent deal with it than for someone who you have a close relationship to investigate it. So from the time someone makes a complaint and the decision seems to be one that before it is done, it will seek to have a certain outcome, that could be what makes things he say, she say. But I will say this, as it relates to sexual harassment cases or any legalities of a sexual nature, no one investigated has the authority to speak about the matter. And that is the legal aspect. So if you are involved in a case and it is something of a sexual nature, by law, you're not allowed to discuss it because it's not a public case.
Right.
So you have to consider that where things become he say, she say, it means that someone spoke. Either somebody spoke or it was a vexatious claim. Because it could go both ways. It may be a vexatious claim, and therefore the intention was to have a lot of he say, she say, or it may be that the claim is not investigated, but the person who's making the claim is made to look as though they are wrong. You with me?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I like that you mentioned vexatious claims, because sometimes, and I've heard of cases where a male and female have had a relationship and things went awry, and then there was a claim of sexual harassment, although there was already an established relationship, and a vexatious claim was made because one party was upset because the other party did not give them what they promised, and they make a vexatious claim. And I know of one case in mind where the claim was made, the gentleman lost his job. It was a tremendous strain and stress on the family, almost lost the family. But it was to the point where there was so much damage done because of this vexatious claim. But once the investigation was made, it became very clear that this was a false claim. It was vexatious. But then you think about the damage that's already done to this person's life and to his loved ones, or it could be her as well, his or her loved ones. And the person who made this vexatious claim oftentimes get to walk away, or depending on what it is, they may be punished by law. But
if it is, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Mrs. Grant.
If it is a vexatious claim, if the Labor Department finds that a person makes a vexatious claim, then they are subject to a fine or imprisonment. That is a very serious consequence of the law, because it can have adverse effects on their family life.
Mm-hmm.
It can have adverse effects on their ability to get another job. And once you're affecting a person's job, you affect their income. Yes. So any claims that turn out to be frivolous or vexatious, the person making that claim now is at the mercy of the court. What we will say, and I am employed by the Crown, so within the Crown, this is what tends to happen. Persons who marry are not generally allowed to work in the same place. And usually when I've seen it as I work in different departments, you can't stop relationships from developing. But many times one person is asked to go somewhere else, or they transfer them somewhere else. Because once people start to get into relationships, sometimes they lose all sense of reasoning when it comes to feelings.
Yeah.
So usually the person who is in the lower position would be transferred somewhere else, but we tend not to encourage workplace relationships, and you don't want to seem petty or that there weren't some workplace relationships that worked out well, but it can have some very serious and dire consequences if things don't go well within the workplace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right. Pastor Griffith had his hand raised earlier. I don't want to I don't want to skip over you, Pastor Griffith, and then we'll come back to the Henrys.
No, what I want to comment on is that we cannot get away from the value of respect at all times to one another.
Yeah.
And I like the idea that need to be emphasized is that the person, we want to make sure that everybody is aware that a person does not have to work in an uncomfortable situation at work. You have redress. And also, the person who is the potential offender is now brought aware that he needs to measure his behavior. And if we think we understand it in the context that provisions has been made that no person has to endure a condition, I think that becomes the most important. And therefore, we will not be worried about, we just heard about the penalty where it is vexatious. And we earlier mentioned the issue of eggshell walking, and we also spoke about culture. And if we can understand the spirit then in which I think the law is made, then we should not really have any difficulty in it, especially if we understand it to be saying that we do not have, in other words, we have redress once we find ourselves in that position. That's all I want to say.
Thank you, Pastor Griffith. Henry's, you have your hand raised?
Good night. I was wondering if Dr. Grant, there are so many situations where the reality is that even if you do feel harassed, you don't say anything because not just for you don't want to say anything, but you're so worried about the repercussions, whether it's in the job or even in church, where you might be labeled as something, isolated and treated a particular way. And especially if it's against someone who is well-liked or well-known or any one of those situations. What do you say to someone in that situation who has been harassed, is being harassed, but just does not want to deal with the consequences? And I say consequences in inverted commas, of course.
Mhm. Good question.
Sometimes it is good to get someone who is trained to deal with matters like that, to deal with them, except if you are a trained counselor. You should really seek to offer that advice, because even counselors would say that they work with the person to come to a solution and not necessarily advice. So the best thing, sorry about my dog barking in the background. The best thing would be, I lost my train of thought, sorry.
So you were thinking, you're saying that sometimes you get a third party, somebody who you're a trusted person.
Someone who can objectively intervene and give the kind of guidance that is needed, because the reality is that it is going to play a mental strain on someone if they, and I have had a person call me to say that every time that school is coming up, this person is supposed to be somebody big in society, well respected, and this person takes care of this person. The caregiver takes care of the father. Father is well known in society and has money. And every time that it is near to school starting, she is made an offer to do something of a sexual nature. So if she works for $400 a week, this person is going to give her $1,000 if she is willing to just do something. It may not necessarily be sex, but it is of a sexual nature. Now, her predicament is, if she doesn't agree to do this, then she doesn't have a job and she needs to support the children. So she has agreed to do one thing, but in agreeing to do that one thing, the person has now upped the money, and where last we could give you $1,000, this we can give you $1,500 if you do that and something else. So she cannot afford to give up the job. what can she do? At that point, that person needs some type of counseling. They need to have counseling because that trained person may be able to help them. And as a trained counselor, they may have information about resources that may be available to that person, where they may not have to accept it, but they may be able to move on and still work someplace. It's not saying that you hide under the carpet because of who the person is in society, but we're dealing with humans. So as much as the law says this person could be prosecuted, the reality is that it's not always easy for a person to have to go through making a claim for sexual harassment. It's not. So sometimes you need the assistance of a trained person to help. It's not easy. The claims of a sexual nature are not easy. It's not even easy within the normal workplace. I'm seeing Sherry's hand is up.
Good night, everyone. Pastor Henry put something in the chat. I wanted you all to respond to it before the session ends.
Oh.
Sherry, could you?
What's it exactly?
Yeah.
I am sorry. The word of God speaks to the females in a union that the female body, she does not have authority over her body, neither does the husband have authority over his body. But his question was, can a man harass his wife sexually?
Why don't I see that?
Okay, let me pull it up.
Okay, so that's the question.
You're seeing it? It says, this is what the Bible says about a man and his wife. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Can a man harass his wife sexually?
I don't know if it would be called harassment,
No.
But in order for it to be harassment, it must be uncomfortable. The person must be unwilling. So if you are married and you are uncomfortable and you are unwilling, even though the Bible says your body is no longer yours, and it may be something deeper than just harassment.
Yeah, I wouldn't consider it
harassment.
of harassment because usually harassment, there's already an established relationship.
Yeah,
it could be
there's a
sexual
relationship.
assault. It could
Assault,
be,
yeah.
but not harassment. No, because there's already an established
Yes, there's a
sexual relationship. But it could be assault.
It could be.
And I still don't see it. So maybe, okay, all right. Yeah. So somebody asked earlier if we could share, and I'm going to share my screen. If we could give a list of things that are considered sexual harassment. And I want to try to share this with you so we can go through this list because there is a list. Can you see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
No?
Yes, you can.
It's a long list. For some reason, I can't.
I could have seen it just now.
You did? All right, let me see if I can. Oh, let me exit full screen. I could probably bring it up.
I don't know if y'all would have heard, once you get the screen ready, there was an article in the paper where this lady was saying that she came to Barbados and she had to leave because the amount of cat calls, now I see cat calling there. And some people were of the opinion that she was just being petty. But when we speak about culture and how things are viewed in one culture as in relation to another, then because the world is so small now, we have to move our culture in such a way that not that we forget who we are, but when it comes to things that may be deemed as disrespectful, because our culture does not see, because we live in a very sexual society, that's a reality. Because we live in a sexual society doesn't mean that when someone comes from a culture that is different, they have to readily accept that they must live in this predominantly sexual society. We must be willing to change so that our conduct is at such a level that we respectfully go into church and deal with anything to do with church. We expect that that is how we live our lives day to day. Right? So what is acceptable within the church is acceptable within society. Go ahead, Dr. Nan.
Oh, are you able to see my screen?
Yes, I am. I don't know if it's everyone else.
Okay, let me, oh, there we go. All right.
The screen is showing. You just need to scroll down that we can see.
Yeah, I'll scroll. Can you see?
Assume that we are reading and scroll downward.
Yes. Can you read though?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I'll scroll down for you. All right.
You see, we have the word unwanted being repeated.
Yes. We see those cat calls, sexual innuendos, personal questions about a person's social or sexual life, kissing sounds, howling, smacking lips, telling lies or spreading rumors about a person's sex life, giving someone a neck massage when they did not ask for it, touching someone, even gifts, giving personal gifts, looking a person up and down. They call those elevator eyes. And they also fall into categories such as verbal. So some of the same things will fall under verbal categories as well as non-verbal. And then you have the physical categories. So there's a lot that falls under this law, that falls under this topic. And we just need to be mindful of it and to treat others with respect. And to me, when you respect someone, you respect yourself. And if you respect yourself, you would treat that person with respect. You know, the golden rule applies here as well. So, Mrs. Grant, I want you to give us some closing words of advice for this group of participants who are not only employees or employers in the workplace, but also who are church members, church leaders, people who work in the church, as well as people who are congregants in the church. What advice would you give to them?
My advice to everyone here is for us to be our brother and sister. Look out for one another. Where you can, give them that shoulder to lean on. Take a responsibility as an individual is that and this is what each person within the workplace has to sign on to say, that I will not tolerate sexual harassment of any form. So once you are required to do that by law, then let's start within our civil society. Let's start within our homes, within the church, and let it extend because you're required, because that's what the law says within the workplace.
But if we want everyone to feel comfortable, we want to see this culture change, we want to where persons no longer feel as vulnerable, then we have to start with ourselves. And I would advise persons that when it comes to the workplace, especially because that's what the law speaks, but as an individual, think first. Consider your actions. When a thought becomes a word, consider how it may make a person feel. We don't know what a person has been through. We don't know what they have faced in life. So we don't know how they would react. So let's start to consider how my brother or sister would feel. And I think if each of us do that, then we start to have a more equal environment, and the vulnerability will start to ease out as it relates to sexual harassment.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Grant, for being our presenter tonight, for bringing information that falls under the legal that fall under the legal domain regarding sexual harassment. Thank you for also sharing how it can relate to the church or the church environment, and thank you for helping us to understand that it really starts with us, that it's important for us to become our brothers and sisters keepers, that we need to treat others with respect the same way we want to be respected, and that if we focus on at least letting others know if we feel uncomfortable about something said or done, that we can hopefully stop the harassment before it becomes harassment, so that others would understand how we feel about comments and so forth. And of course, also understand that sometimes we have to take it within the context of the situation and make our judgment based on the context, so that we are not being frivolous or vexatious in our claims when we know for a fact that we're not being harassed. I am now going to thank all of you for being here with us this evening. I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Henry, our host pastor, and we will try to bring this to a close, to be mindful of everybody's time. Pastor Henry.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Neff and Ms. Grant. We do appreciate your service to us. This has been a topic that we wanted to get on air for a very long time, and thank you for helping us to broadcast in it. I hope that we are much wiser and smarter. As you discussed this evening, some of the steps in dealing with the whole idea of sexual harassment, my mind goes back to the teachings of Jesus. They were there from ever since, that someone offends you, you go to them, you talk to them about it. If they do not hear you, you take someone with you. I think that's where the investigator comes in, and you talk to them about it. And then if they do not hear you, then you take them to the church. In your case, the workplace, the courts, or the Ministry of Labor. So thank you so very much. We should not have sexual harassment in the church. If you feel uncomfortable, you should talk about it. So the next time you give me that bear hug, I know now that I am going to talk to you about it. I know I'm so I'm not going to stay uncomfortable. I'm going to tell you, listen, I don't need to be here. So thank you so very much for opening up this subject for us. And we trust that in the future, that we can rely on you to help us again in these areas as we continue to serve the Lord. For those of you who may not know, and I think all of you do know, we do have a 2-minute broadcast that we try to help you get the day with. These are done by the members of Faith Tabernacle. And if you do not, we ask you to just send some friend of Faith Tabernacle, the person who invited you to the program this evening, send a message to them. We'll get you on our mailing list and make sure every morning you're getting our devotions. Next 2 weeks, we will be back with another discussion on Real Talk, and it deals with the how the devices impacting on family life. So join us, and next 2 weeks, I think today is the 12th, so the 26th of October, we're going to be having that discussion. And the Lord do bless you richly. Do have a wonderful evening. Thank the brethren from Barbados here with CEF Miracle Center and all the other groups where you are joining from. The Lord bless you richly, St. Vincent and all the other places. Do have a wonderful, wonderful Tuesday evening. Good night.
Thank you very much once again for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Ms. Grant, for being
Thank you,
here.
Mrs. Grant.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Everyone.
Good night.
Good night. Pleasant good night, everyone.
Good night.
Henry, could we close the stream?